Principal Matters Podcast, episode 407. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, a school leaders podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your school leadership. This week, you're going to hear an engaging conversation between Dr. Jen Schwanke and our guest, Justin Baeder, talking about supporting teacher growth. If you wonder about the invisible work that goes into effective teaching and leadership, you're going to love this conversation where Jen dives deeply with Justin Baeder, author and veteran instructional leader, about takeaways from his newest book, Mapping Professional Practice, How to Develop Instructional Frameworks to Support Teacher Growth, that he co-authored with Heather Bell Williams. Justin shares his practical takes on accountability, the careful dance of driving school improvement, and he talks about the practices that he believes triumph over many traditional ones. So check out his amazing resources at Principal Center, and you'll see a link in the show notes. And I just want to say a big thanks to Jen and Justin for this insightful journey into enhancing the essence of teaching and learning. Justin is a repeat guest on the show. You can hear his 2017 interview about his first book at my website if you want to just search for episode 86, believe it or not. Wow, that was a long time ago. So thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jen, for this great conversation. And Principal Matters listeners, thank you for listening and for doing what matters. And I hope you enjoyed today's show.
Hi, Principal Matters listeners. We are here today with a very special guest, my friend, longtime friend, Justin Baeder, who I met, gosh, it's been about 8 years, right, Justin?
It has, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thrilled to have Justin on today. We have a lot of things we're going to cover and get Justin's thoughts on a lot of things going on in education. So, Justin, I'm going to stop and you're going to start. Tell us about yourself and your journey as an educator.
Well, Jen, thank you so much. It's really an honor to turn the tables here and be a guest with you and have a chance to chat again. Yeah, so I'm director of the Principal Center, which I've been doing since about 2012. And prior to that, I spent 10 years with Seattle Public Schools as a middle school science teacher and elementary principal and elementary kind of dean of students in between. And yeah, I'm just really enjoying continuing to be a part of our profession.
So, for those listeners of ours who aren't sure what the Principal Center is, tell us about that. Go into the details we all need.
Sure, yeah. So the Principal Center provides primarily tools and professional development on instructional leadership, as well as help with the admin job search. And my passion is around instructional leadership, classroom walkthroughs, teacher evaluation, and those topics. So that's what we focus on, and that's what our tools are geared around.
Great, great. So we're gonna, listeners, at the end of this podcast, we will let you know how to get a hold of Justin. So hang on because we're going to talk about a couple of other things first. You mentioned kind of the focus of your work at the Principal Center, although I know you're open to any kind of professional development, any kind of questions principals might ask. But you have written two books, and I'd like to talk about those for a moment because I think they really do capture who you are and the nature of your work. So the first one was out in 2017, and it was titled Now We're Talking 21 Days to High Performance Instructional Leadership. Tell us about your decision to write that book, what you hope resonates with your readers, how that affects principals today.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to see the continued reception to Now We're Talking. It seems to be the best-selling book on classroom walkthroughs and just continues to do well. And I'm very happy about that because that means that school leaders are getting into classrooms and seeing what's going on. And I think, if you listen to teachers, the number one complaint about administrators is that they don't know what it's like. They don't know what it's like to be a teacher. They don't know what's going on in classrooms. And I think the solution to that is obviously to be in classrooms, to see teachers doing their work, to understand it, to talk with them about their work. And I take a little bit of a different perspective that it's not so much about the feedback that we give, certainly that's part of it, but I think it really is about the understanding, about seeing people actually at work doing what they do, not just having meetings with them about it separately, not just doing goal setting and looking at data, but actually seeing people teach. And then crucially, talking with them about that teaching, processing it, getting a sense of the invisible thinking and the judgment and the decision making that go into teaching. Because I think one of the big misconceptions about teaching is that it's strictly observable, right? That what you see is what you get, that everything that matters is visible. But if you look at any good evaluation framework like the Danielson framework, a lot of it is not directly observable. A lot of it is not visible. So we have to talk about it if we want to understand teacher practice.
So I think any listener right now who is a teacher is pulling out their pom-poms and cheering right now, because that is such a fundamental truth about teaching. How many times have we heard a teacher say, well, yeah, my administrator came in, but they didn't see the good stuff, or they didn't see what I had done to lead up to that. They feel a little bit like their work is stripped down to, say, a 45-minute observation. But you're right, to get into classrooms does build more of a sense of what it's like to be a teacher. And I'm so glad you made that distinction, because you and I are both parts of some social media groups. And I see principals all the time saying, what should the feedback look like? What should I put on the post-it note I leave? Should I leave a little piece of candy? And but you're saying that's not what it's about. It's about immersing in the experience, right?
Yeah, I think it's about paying attention. It's about listening. It's about getting a sense of the teacher's perspective. But it's also about something very basic that I think we overlook, and that is frequency. The big problem with formal observations is that there just aren't very many of them, right? You just don't have time to visit every classroom 20 times and stay for an hour each time. We just don't have that kind of time. If you have 30 or 40 teachers you evaluate, you just can't do that. So visiting for short blocks of time frequently, 5, 10, 15 minutes at most is plenty. But if we stop by, 15 or 20 times over the course of the school year, we have just a much greater opportunity to see something that's worth talking about, to get a more general sense of what's going on in a classroom, and not be in that situation of oh, you just missed it, right? Like teachers always say that, oh, I wish you had been here an hour earlier because we were doing something really cool and you would have seen, not the part where they're working independently at their desks, but you would have seen the really cool part. That is much less likely to happen. We're much less likely to miss the good stuff when we show up frequently, and we're much more likely to have a good sense of what typical practice is like, because that's really what we're seeking to evaluate, right? We're not trying to catch people at their worst. We're not trying to see a dog and pony show of people putting on an artificial best. We're trying to get a sense of where people's practice really is. And to do that, it makes sense to give ourselves lots of at-bats, lots of samples, because we know that luck is not on our side at any given time. If we only show up a few times, we're not going to see enough.
So as a principal, when I did walkthroughs, there were two, I'm going to be very honest and vulnerable here. There were two feelings I did not like within myself. One was the awkwardness. I felt awkward. Now that eventually dissipated with a lot of visits, to your point. The second thing I wasn't sure about is, do I ever intervene with a behavior situation with a student who's maybe in a small group and not getting it, and I know they're not getting it? Do I mind my own business, or do I insert myself? What would you advise?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the lesson itself, I wouldn't intervene. I think the risk of a misconception, or if of a teacher misspeaking or misexplaining a concept, I think is pretty low, and they'll have the opportunity to fix that. And I don't want to be in the position of second guessing a teacher or kind of taking their authority away, in their lesson. I think that could be a pretty humiliating thing. I think when it comes to behavior, I think it is appropriate to walk out with a student whose behavior is just not conducive to the lesson. And people need to know that we have their backs when it comes to behavior, and students need to know that we are on the lookout for behavior that is not compatible with learning. So yeah, I think it's completely appropriate to intervene, and not expect teachers to be able to teach a lesson and solve an individual behavior problem in the moment. So I can't think of a lot of situations where I did that, but I think it's absolutely appropriate.
Right. So that's it doesn't surprise me that the book continues to sell well, because I think a lot of principals have questions about this. They want to be present, they want to be visible, they don't want the criticism that they don't get it. And so they want to do this right. And there's a lot of anxiety there because they don't want to create any sort of barrier. I always tell my first principal, who I loved, she had these long acrylic nails. And whenever she stopped by, she would take notes on her computer. And it was like, it was such a disruption. And so I was like, well, never disrupt when I interrupt. But of course, every interruption is a disruption, but it doesn't have to be, I think is what you're saying. It should be part of the school culture.
Yeah, and there's going to be a certain period of adjustment where we're just breaking the ice. It is going to be a disruption the first time you stop by. The teacher might stop and say, "Oh, what do you need? Can I help you?" The students might be surprised, but yeah, by the second or third or fourth time, they're completely used to it. They know that you're just going to continue doing that, and it's not a disruption. I think in terms of the other behaviors that we engage in the classroom, obviously if we can type quietly, I would rather type quietly. I think it's also possible to not type at all.
Right.
And one of the things that I've been returning to as a powerful idea recently is just the idea of handwritten notes, that we can take handwritten notes ourselves. And I experimented as soon as ChatGPT added this feature. I said, can ChatGPT actually read my handwriting and turn it into typed text? Because I don't want to force my terrible handwriting on someone else if I can possibly avoid it. So we actually were successful in testing that and getting our repertoire app to read handwriting and turn it into text. So if you do want to email the teacher something that's legible and not send them a hard to read handwritten note, you can absolutely do that. But on the other hand, people like handwritten notes. So I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with leaving a handwritten note, and certainly taking your own notes on paper is fine. But I think people do get used to whatever we do. I think people kind of accept laptops for formal observations. I think that's just kind of a universally understood thing now. And yeah, if we can type quietly, maybe not pick the loudest keyboard on the market, we can maybe be a little bit less of a of a disruption.
Well, and I worked with a principal once who was so good at classroom visits, but everyone he entered, it was like Kramer from Seinfeld. Like it was he roared in, and I used to tease him. And eventually the teachers got to the point where they could tease him. Once they realized that nothing was punitive and he didn't have a laptop, it became sort of a joke within the school. But I think the point of all of this is to reflect on our own behaviors too, not just the classrooms that we're walking into.
Yeah, well
So
said.
your next book was Mapping Professional Practice, and that just came out a couple years ago. So tell us about this book and, again, why you decided to write it and what resonated with your readers.
Yeah, so mapping professional practice really came from an appreciation for the Danielson framework and an appreciation for those invisible aspects of teacher practice that matter to the decisions that we make as instructional leaders, but that don't lend themselves as ready to direct observation. And if you think about things like domain 1, planning and preparation, or domain 4, professional responsibilities, typically those don't come up directly in an observation because they're not directly observable during a lesson. They reflect things that teachers do outside of class time, or they reflect judgments that they make kind of invisibly in their heads. And when it comes to helping people improve, how do we, the question was, how do we do that if we don't have any observable evidence? So in putting that book together, my co-author, Heather Bell Williams, and I looked at ways that we could get at that. We think of it like an iceberg, right? Teacher practice is like an iceberg where the tip of the iceberg is visible. Your planning and preparation is visible during the lesson to some extent, right? Whatever materials you prepared, whatever happens in the lesson, but we don't really know what happened behind the scenes. 90% of that iceberg is floating beneath the surface. So we came up with a process for using that visible evidence to kind of work backward and see, okay, what went into this? What is the rest of that iceberg? And then the process of developing instructional frameworks, which is kind of in the subtitle of the book, is all about articulating what those invisible dimensions of the practice look like as well, so that if we want to help someone improve, and like, let's say, one thing we're focused on right now is peer observations. Let's say I have a teacher who's struggling in a particular area and I want them to go observe a peer. It's very easy for them to miss what they need to see from that peer, precisely because so much of what makes the difference in their practice is not directly observable. If we can't see it, someone who is not good at that practice is certainly not going to be able to see it. So we have to find ways to make the invisible more visible. And of course, one crucial starting point for doing that is talking with people and getting their perspective on why they're doing what they're doing and what's going on in their heads when they are doing it. So the book is all about that.
Right. You and I talked last week, by the way, in an episode for the Principal Center that you will air. But you said something very that kind of shifted my thinking. I've been mulling it over ever since. You said peer observations are great, but sometimes people don't get what they need to out of it. And so I think that's what you're saying. Tell us a little more about someone who might walk away from peer observation and it wasn't helpful.
Sure. And I can speak from personal experience as a new teacher in this, the experience of going into another classroom and realizing okay, a lot of things seem to be the same, but the results are very different. Like, why is this person getting different results? And we tend to focus on, oh, their kids must be different. They have better behaved kids, or they have some sort of equipment in their classroom that I don't have. So we focus on surface features or assumptions that don't really translate to practice. Like I can't get your kids to be in my class. I have I have my kids, and probably they're actually kind of the same. It's just that you're doing some different things that I'm not able to see. And Heather had kind of the same experience with sending teachers on a peer observation, only to have them come back and ask for things to be purchased for their classroom that had like nothing to do with what they were going to observe for. Like, oh, you have this really cool set of whatever. It's like, you don't need microscopes to set a clear objective for your lesson. Like, it's not about that.
Yeah, they get
So,
very expensive for the school budget, right?
and I think when we're putting people on PIPs and we're sending people on peer observations to help them improve, it's easy to feel like we're kind of under the microscope to say yes to those things, even if they're not relevant, because then it looks like we're not supporting them. So I think we really have to be intentional about keeping the focus on practice and saying, here is what this person is doing well. So I think a good first step really is to go observe the peer yourself and see, what is this person doing that I want the struggling teacher to notice, and then calling that out, especially if it's not directly observable. Like, notice the way this teacher is making decisions about pacing or about the type of questions they ask, that kind of thing, so that we can set the teacher who's going to be observing up for success so that they notice those things and think about them.
Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. As a school leader, you have a vision of a thriving, supportive educational environment where every teacher and student can succeed. With DigiCoach, you can turn that vision into reality. Imagine walking into a classroom with DigiCoach on your mobile device. Its customizable look-fors and pre-written feedback statements streamline your feedback process, saving you precious time. You're not just observing, you're actively supporting your teachers while generating data to drive instructional change. With the new coaching plan feature, you can effortlessly document action plans and coaching conversations. This ensures every teacher is supported and you can track their progress related to your campus goals. DigiCoach empowers you to customize the platform to fit your specific needs, reinforcing your vision at every step. And when you need support, the DigiCoach team becomes your team, with consulting efforts focused on realizing your organization's goals. By using DigiCoach, you lead your school to remarkable progress. Ready to turn your vision into reality? Visit digicoach.com and tell them that Will Parker sent you. Everyone talks about the power of data-driven instruction, but what does that actually look like? Look no further than IXL, the ultimate online learning and teaching platform for K-12. IXL gives you meaningful insights that drive real progress, and research can prove it. Studies in nearly all 50 states show that schools that use IXL outperform other schools on state tests. Educators who use IXL love that they can easily see how their school is performing in real time to make better instructional decisions. And IXL doesn't stop at just data. IXL also brings an entire ecosystem of resources for your teachers with a complete curriculum, personalized learning plans, and so much more. It's no wonder that IXL is used in 95 of the top 100 school districts. Ready to join them? Visit IXL.com/PM to get started.
Right. That makes so much sense. I'm thinking about one of the most effective, skilled, masterful teachers I have ever worked with. And she, people would come across. I work in a very large district, and there were a lot of teachers that would go do visits. They were led by instructional coaches, and people would come out of it and say, these are my words, not theirs. Well, there wasn't much really to talk about. All the work she had done for weeks leading up to that moment were not observable, right?
Right.
The classroom norms, the way that we as a class are going to talk to one another, the way we're going to handle pieces of paper when we are done with them. Like, all of those things took so much work, but they weren't visible. So I love the idea of a principal pointing out, here's what you need to look for. Here's what you're seeing that you don't think you're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. right there. And I think back to the late great Harry Wong, who tells the story of the teacher who did such a good job teaching routines and procedures and setting expectations and developing a class culture that was geared toward learning, that even when the teacher was absent and the sub didn't show up, I think we've all heard that story of the teacher whose sub didn't show up, and yet the class ran successfully for the entire day anyway. Nobody even bothered to tell the office, kids just did their work and it was fine. And I love that as an example of the invisible work that teachers do that sets them up for success every day and makes their daily lessons often not look like they're doing much, right? Like it looks like a cakewalk. It looks like magic and it looks effortless when you've done a really good job of setting things up and people don't see the hard work that went into getting it to that point. So I think with observations, we call this observability bias, the tendency to think that what I can see is all that matters. Like everything that has ever occurred in this classroom, I'm seeing right now. It's just the words that are coming out of this teacher's mouth in the moment. It's where they're standing. It's their body language. It's the materials they're using. It's what's on the board. And if you look at, again, any good evaluation framework, it talks about a lot that happened in advance or behind the scenes or invisibly in the teacher's head. So what you see is not all there is. There's always more to that iceberg of practice.
Right. I was presenting at ASCD a couple weeks ago we were talking about conflict, and I made a joke and I said, let's create some conflict in this room. And so I had people raise their hands, pancakes or waffles, or I don't know, puppies or rainbow. I don't even know what I did. And then I said, now let's get real. And one of the questions I asked the group, and there were probably 300 people in there, I said, how many of you believe that you should collect lesson plans? And about a third raised their hands. How many believe you should not? About a third. And then I said, how many of you say it depends? And the final third. And what struck me about that, and what you're saying, is a lesson plan, a piece of paper, cannot, in any scope of anyone's imagination, capture all the work that went up to that lesson. So, what is your feeling on lesson plans? Not just collecting them, but what they say and how they matter for teacher planning.
Yeah, and I think I've actually written an article on this coming out against requiring lesson plans, except maybe in cases where there's some sort of plan of improvement, there's a documented issue, and clearly this person needs to really have some accountability for planning. I think as a general step, like I understand historically why lesson plans are often required, but having been in a district that had pretty good curriculum in place, if you have good curriculum, a lot of the lesson planning is redundant, or what you do to get ready for a lesson isn't going to really be relevant to creating a document for somebody else. Like I think primarily lesson planning needs to be for the teacher and for the students and not for the principal. I think in a lot of cases where they're required, it's because there's not a good curriculum. It's like the administrator legitimately has no idea what's going to be taught because there's not a curriculum. I think, well, that's kind of a district problem to solve at a systemic level. If we don't have a curriculum and if we're requiring people to make everything up as they go along, I think that creates a workload issue and it creates an alignment issue across the district. So I think there are better ways to solve that problem. And then when it comes to knowing what's going on in the classroom, I think the other reason people tend to ask for lesson plans is they don't get into classrooms, so they don't know what's going on. And I personally would much, much, much rather see for myself and be seen in the classroom and build relationships than look at documents. And if you look at the numbers, if you were to think about doing a classroom walkthrough in every classroom during every single lesson, you would realize, okay, we have too many lessons going on every single day. I can't do that. And I recommend that people visit classrooms 3 times a day. And that typically gets you around to everybody about once every 2 weeks. And you're not going to see every subject that every teacher teaches every 2 weeks. It's going to take longer than that. But when it comes to looking at lesson plans, somehow we think I can review every lesson plan for every subject, for every teacher, every week. And there are people who do that. I know there are people who do that. I don't want to I don't want to downplay the effort they're putting in. But my question is that the best use of our time? Do we really have time to look at that many documents, give meaningful feedback on them? I mean, probably not. And if we are putting in that time, I think that time would be better spent on other work. So I think this needs to be a very limited and targeted thing if we do it at all.
I could not agree with you more. And as you were talking, I was thinking of an image of a principal in their office, door closed, going through lesson plans, much like somebody would grade papers, versus out in the, in the air of it, in the, breathing, seeing, feeling what's actually happening in that classroom. Because anybody can write a lesson plan that seems like it's going to be a good lesson. But at the end of the day, if the principal barrier, puts a barrier up between the piece of paper that says what's going to happen and what actually happens, I think that creates an us versus them dynamic in a school that can be pretty damaging.
Yeah, well said.
So you have been thoughtful and courageous in some of the things you've said about accountability. You and I talked about it briefly last week, and I think this is a conversation that teachers are desperate for principals to have. Talk to me about the word accountability as you see it and how it should or is or isn't finding its way into conversations about education these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking especially of student accountability, I think this is an issue that we really are having a lot of conversation around as a professional. So I'm not talking about, holding schools accountable with high stakes tests, although I think those tests are providing a different lens these days. What I'm talking about is in terms of discipline and grades, especially, that a lot of schools are trying to get better results by backing off on accountability for behavior and for learning. And as far as I can tell, that is not going well. It is not working well because I think that accountability does a lot of heavy lifting that we maybe didn't appreciate, and it can feel punitive. I don't think it is punitive, but it can feel punitive to have that accountability in place, and it can feel kind to students to remove that accountability. But if that were working, I think we would see more success stories. And I think the stories that we're seeing nationally indicate that it's not working. And even internationally, it is not working to remove accountability for behavior or for learning in the form of grades.
Right. I think this is a crucial conversation to have. I was visiting a district in North Carolina a couple weeks ago over spring break, and there was a student who had begun to throw the hall passes. And the district's protocol in that situation was remove all the other students. So 26 third graders walked out of the classroom and stood in the hall while the student in the room continued to throw the hall passes. And I said to the principal, tell that student no. And she said, oh, well, we don't, he's getting his feelings out, which I understand. I want to be very clear. I understand that. But now we have disrupted 26 paths of learning. And so I I think we have to talk about that. And I understand all of the thinking behind supporting students as they work through things. But one of my favorite sentences ever is no is a complete sentence. And there's times I think we have to say no. I think we've got to get there.
Yeah, and I think what we have to recognize is that our students do not stay students forever. They become adults, and they become the kind of adults that we equip them to be along the way. And right now, we're engaged in a massive experiment of allowing whatever behavior students want to exhibit, to get their feelings out, as as you were told. And I think we're going to realize very quickly that the behaviors that we have convinced ourselves we can accept in schools, like if we're willing to evacuate the classroom and take everybody else somewhere where they can be safe and allow the lesson to stop because of that behavior, like we might not realize that we're setting that student up for, being arrested as an adult if they do the same thing. I think there just needs to be an awareness of kind of what trajectory we're putting kids on. And I think in a lot of cases, the traditional things that we've done, like say no, have a consequence, send a kid home, they actually do change the behavior. And I'm seeing a lot of assumptions now that go the opposite direction, that say, oh no, suspension never changes kids' behavior. Well, like then why historically have 50% of suspensions never been repeated, right? If a kid gets suspended once, there's a 50% chance they will never get suspended again. If they get suspended twice, there's a 50% chance they will never get suspended a third time. So this idea that consequences don't work, that setting expectations doesn't work, that we just have to kind of have an understanding response to any kind of behavior, I think just doesn't square with any evidence. And it's kind of an untested assertion that people now are making, that none of those things that we've always done actually work. Well, I mean, we've been able to keep schools mostly safe and mostly orderly for hundreds of years with those same expectations. What I think we're trying to do now is we're trying to fix everything for every kid, and we're frustrated that we can't. Like I feel bad for that kid who's throwing hall passes in the classroom so that the classroom has to be evacuated. If I could push a magic button and fix whatever's going on in that kid's life so that their behavior was, more compatible with being around other people, I would push that button. I gladly would. And I think as educators, we tend to not put any limits on what we're capable of. We tend to think we can fix everything. We tend to think there is an educational solution, there is a caring solution that is going to make the difference for every student. And that makes us eager to give up relying on any kind of accountability and saying, okay, you have to go home because you're throwing stuff at other kids. Well, it feels like we're giving up, but it's only giving up if there was actually something else that we could do to fix that. And I'm not convinced that there always is something else we can do. Like if we evacuate the classroom and that kid just starts throwing hall passes every day, we haven't fixed it. This is not better for that student or anybody else.
Right. And I think you nailed it when you said we're trying to find a solution for every student. And we know better. We know every student is different. We know that we can't say, okay, well, no student will ever get suspended. It's just, it goes against everything we know and understand about students and their backgrounds and their stories and all of that. Sometimes people on these, on a social media forum, if you'll say something brave about that, and I say brave because of what I'm about to say, which is you'll get snipped at sometimes by people. They snip or they snap or they imply that anyone, myself included, who proposes more accountability or proposes saying no, the implication is, well, you don't really get it, or you're not sympathetic to the child's story. And how do you reconcile those kind of responses with what you know and believe?
Yeah, and often they do get quite nasty and accusatory, and people will say things, well, I'm glad you don't work with my kid and things like that. And,
Okay,
you
so
know,
see, better than I did. Thank you.
and I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves, who has actually done this work? Who has actually run a school and kept it safe? I've heard of a lot of schools where the approaches that people like to talk about online have failed miserably. And, so I think anybody can kind of armchair quarterback the principalship and say that they could do it better. But the reality is we know what keeps schools safe. We know what allows learning to take place, and we don't always have alternatives. So I think when it comes to, kind of speaking up on behalf of, kind of status quo practices, like we don't like defending the status quo because defending the status quo feels like failing to improve. And my pushback on that more recently has been I'm not willing to defend the status quo against something better, but I am willing to make sure first that the thing that people are saying is better actually is better before we let go of something that's working to some extent. Right? Like I don't think anything we're doing in education is the best that we will ever come across. Like I think there's always room for improvement, but just because somebody has a new idea doesn't mean it's a good idea. Like the history of education is full of terrible new ideas that have been tried really big, really fast, and then just flopped. I mean, that is what we do, right? Is we try new things too fast, we don't learn from them, and then they crash and burn. So I think we've got to slow down a little bit and make sure the new stuff works.
And the other thing we do, Justin, is a pendulum. Everything goes
Yeah.
way far one way and then way far the other. And a lot of people talk about the reading wars, and they don't know that the reading wars have gone back to before 1900. And the reading wars really are a pendulum. Let's go really far this way, let's go really far that way. And we don't ever say, okay, wait a minute, what's in the middle, or what worked in the past, or oh wait, kids are different. And it's a little mind-boggling to me how poorly we do at learning from our own experiments, and our use of the word innovation, which was all the rage about 10 years ago. It's quieted down somewhat, but innovate, innovate, innovate. And, let's think about flexible seating in a classroom. That was, still like, I'm not sure that's the best approach, and apologies to any teacher who has a coffee shop feel in their classroom. But if you talk to kids, they'll say, I want my own desk. I want my own space. I don't want anybody touching my stuff. I don't want to go sit on a beanbag chair and put my feet up. So, a lot, again, pendulum, it goes from one extreme to the other. And I think we lose a lot of prior knowledge when we lead that way.
Well, I think one of the things we have to do is turn the rhetorical heat down and not confuse kind of a righteousness or a moral standpoint that we need to do our best for kids with putting, a moral argument behind an untested idea. And I think when it comes to the status quo, like people have a righteous zeal to attack the status quo that is almost right. It is almost right to want to attack the status quo. Again, the thing is, though, what we're replacing it with has to be better. And the pendulum swings come from the fact that we put this moral cause and energy behind something that is unproven, and then we overshoot. The pendulum swings too far. A lot of the new stuff tends to be worse than the old stuff that we were attacking. And we don't approach it like scientists. We don't say, okay, we will try this new thing, we'll learn from it, maybe it'll fail, but if it's better, we'll stick with it. And I think that's the approach that we have to start taking to improvement, because if we just have this kind of attack mode on anything that is not the latest and greatest, we're constantly going to be churning through new bad ideas. And like part of I think what we have to appreciate is that we didn't invent the education profession in the last 5 years. Like, there has been a lot of experimentation already and a lot of kind of coming to the best solutions for things. So the difficulty of finding new things that are actually better is now quite high, right? Like, if you were to try to invent a new wonder drug, well, like, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked. So it is actually quite hard to develop something new and better now. Like, if you're going to beat ibuprofen, like, good luck, right? And I feel like we've discovered a lot of what there is to discover in education, not everything, but the low-hanging fruit has been picked. And I think that means we just have to kind of cool it a little bit and realize that finding practices that are better, that can get dramatically different results, is harder now than it ever has been, because we have already learned so much of what there is to learn. And we have to be very skeptical of people who make grand claims for completely new and unproven practices.
Well, and don't even get me started on grand plans that are, vendor based, where people want to make money off of it, right? Like, and I see principals who are not confident about their leadership, and they want a vendor, they want a salesperson to come in and say, this will solve all your problems. And it just makes me crazy, because, we sometimes forget that good teaching trumps any vendor product that you're ever going to buy. And that is probably where I think the investment should be.
Yeah,
So,
and especially, like, if you remember when Common Core hit, do you remember the Common Core stickers that, like, existing textbooks would get Common Core stickers stuck on them? And I feel like that happens with every type of reform, that that people are saying the same things they were saying yesterday, but as soon as a new fad comes along, we put a different sticker on it and sell it as the latest and greatest thing. So we do have to be more skeptical about things like that.
love a good logo, love a good endorsement, absolutely, but none of it trumps good teaching. So
Yeah. Well said.
Well, Justin, you are so fun to talk to, because you're so articulate and so clearly intelligent, and you've thought about all these things. And I want to make sure that we spread your connection to principals. So tell us where our listeners can find you.
Sure. Principalcenter.com is the best place, because that's where you get the things that I've been working on for the longest time, things I've thought about the most. Social media is where I talk about things that I have not thought about as much, but that are, current events or current fads that I think need some analysis. So I'm on TikTok and Twitter at EduLeadership, but principalcenter.com is the main place to go for the long-term work that I've been doing. And Justin at principalcenter.com is my email.
Perfect. It's been an honor to talk to you again, Justin. I think our paths will continue, because I'm following what you're doing, and I love the thought that you put into everything you say. So thank you for that. And Principal Matters listeners, thanks for tuning in to listen to Justin Baeder, and make sure you look him up. He's got a lot of great things to do.
Thank you so much, Jen. Likewise, and I appreciate it.
You'll find free resources like this one at williamdparker.com. Subscribe for our free weekly newsletter, which contains bonus material, and also check out the links for Grow Academies, Masterminds, Executive Coaching, and Keynote presentations for my books, as well as for Principal Matters Associates. You can find out more under our speakers tab at williamdparker.com. Thank you for learning together, and thank you for doing what matters.